Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Father John Dear, Reverend John Dear. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Lorene.
Tell us a little about your background. You're a Catholic priest, Christian pacifist, activist, author. Tell us a little about your background.
Well, I've been here in New Mexico for about 14 years, but I work full-time around the country and around the world for peace. Somebody asked, that's just what I do, and I'm a Catholic priest, and I write books and lecture. But mainly I'm trying to teach nonviolence in the tradition of Martin Luther King and Gandhi. How can we become people of nonviolence? How can we create a more nonviolent country in a nonviolent world? Actually, I travel a lot and lecture full-time around the world, but I'm also organizing bottom-up grassroots movements in the tradition of Gandhi and King against war and poverty and nuclear weapons and environmental destruction, and trying to say, not only personally do we need to live nonviolent lives, but how can we build a more nonviolent world? So that's my passion, my work. I do it as a church person, and in particular, I'm, involved here in New Mexico to get rid of nuclear weapons.
Well, there's that billboard on the way to Albuquerque. It started here, let's end it here.
Right, yeah.
And so, but I have followed you for many, many years. You make the news a lot because you are constantly being arrested in nonviolent civil disobedient things. I think you've been arrested over 75 times.
Right.
And also at 9/11, on September 11th, you were in New York and you were the coordinator of chaplains.
Yeah.
Tell me a little about that.
Well, I had just stepped down as the director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. It's the largest interfaith peace group in the country and the world. And so it was strange. I was free at the moment. I was actually supposed to be having breakfast in the second tower with my parents. My mother canceled out 2 days before. We canceled the reservation. I went down to volunteer to help. By chance, met the head of the Red Cross. And she said, well, will you coordinate the chaplains? And so I did, starting immediately. So I had 600 chaplains ministering to 50,000 direct relatives, spouse, child, or parent, the Family Assistance Center. And I worked at Ground Zero once or twice a week, full-time for 3 months. And at the same time, I was helping to organize the demonstrations in Times Square against the U.S. bombing of Afghanistan, saying war is not the way to bring peace. And as a Christian, I was saying, well, we love our neighbors and we love our enemies. And that work got me in so much trouble from church people that I was asked to leave New York, and that's what actually brought me to New Mexico. I chose to come here after that.
Why New Mexico?
I love it. It's so beautiful, and I have friends here, and there's work to be done.
Oh, there's work to be done everywhere.
Yeah.
But thank you for choosing us. You've been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize many times, but Archbishop Desmond Tutu had nominated you, and what he said was that you are the embodiment of a peacemaker. You believe that peace is not something static, but rather to make peace is to be engaged body, mind, and spirit. He is a man who has the courage of his convictions and who speaks out and acts against war, the manufacture of weapons, and any situation where a human being might be at risk through violence. Yeah. Well, that's our world today.
Yeah.
We're very much all at risk through violence.
Right. And violence doesn't work. And violence has failed us, and it's an epidemic, and it's everywhere, and it's inside us, and we're, it's just getting away. 35 wars, 1 billion people are starving, at least 16,000 nuclear weapons, corporate greed leading to catastrophic climate change. And then so when you look at the world, as a world of violence, we don't have time to get into racism, sexism, torture, executions. And it's like normal now and legitimate. And this violence is legal. And so then comes Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King and these great peacemakers in our own lifetime saying, Violence doesn't work, war doesn't work. We have to stop this and figure out a new way to resolve our conflict. And they use the old, ancient, clumsy word, nonviolence. And I think that's our only hope. But of course, that's at the heart of every major religion too, from Christianity to Judaism to Islam to Buddhism. It's all, we're called to be people of nonviolence. How we're going to do that is the challenge.
Well, when did the nonviolent movement, can we call it that, actually start? And besides Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., who are the pillars?
Well, these are great questions. It's just beginning. I mean, you could argue the peace movement, whatever that is, a global peace movement, it's only 50 or 60 years old. I mean, so much.
But isn't global war only 50 or 60 years old?
No.
Global war?
No, there have always been wars.
I know there's always
leading
been
up
war,
to World War One.
Yeah.
No, I think historically what happened is the abolitionists working to end slavery, and that leads to the suffragists, and that leads to, the beginning of the labor movement and the civil rights movement, but the emergence of Mahatma Gandhi, who's saying everything has to change, and we have to become nonviolent people and create a nonviolent world. He leads to Martin Luther King, who is just the greatest figure in our country. And that gives birth to King and the civil rights movement, to the women's movement, the environmental movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. We are just beginning. So very few people, even, I wonder, Lorraine, what you think, when you talk about Martin Luther King, few people in the media talk about his nonviolence. And yet that was the fundamental value and bedrock of his vision. And so we're just talking now of a global peace movement, or I call it a global grassroots movement of nonviolence. But what's so exciting, and you don't hear about this in the media too, is that the last 30 years there have been 85 nonviolent revolutions, nonviolent ending of wars. This never happened before in history. We now know, you can study all these books coming out about nonviolent social change. 2/3 of the human race are personally involved in grassroots, bottom-up movements for nonviolent social change. This is very hopeful. It's not being reported. And what interests me is that how does change happen? How do we end war and extreme poverty and nuclear weapons? Historically, change only happens through bottom-up grassroots movements and that eventually push governments. So that's what my friends and I are working on, a global grassroots movement. We're trying to connect the dots and the issues. It's being forced upon us now with catastrophic climate change. This is what Tutu is now really interested in, other big leaders. And my take is that everybody's got to get involved. You have to get involved in trying to help the world become a more peaceful, just place. We need everybody.
Gandhi, I don't know, liberated, I guess, India from the British Empire.
Yeah.
The British Empire was what was happening in the world.
Right.
They controlled the entire world.
He got them to leave
one
nonviolently.
man.
Right.
Yeah.
Without a telephone or fax or computers.
Yeah.
That's what. And he inspired everybody to become, saying, we can become nonviolent. We can give our lives for this just struggle for India, and we can do it nonviolently. So I thought in 1942 he had 300,000 people in jail for protesting the British rule. And of course they in the end rejected the nonviolence, and the Civil War, the partition led to the death of 1 million people. And he died, he went to his death in great grief because in effect, he got the British to leave nonviolently, but then the Indian Hindus and Muslims killed each other. That's why we have to go beyond Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and all of us have to really search our souls. How can we really become nonviolent people? This is the spiritual life. What's the point of praying and going to church if you deep down still want to commit violence and hurt people? And as we're doing that, meanwhile, we all have to be involved in the work of a whole new kind of vision of the world, with a world without weapons of mass destruction, a world where no one is starving to death, ending environmental destruction, all of these things.
It would appear that this Pope has taken a step right back to the Bible and the essence of Christianity, and has done such amazing things in terms of the environment, in terms of banking, in terms of all of these things. And a lot of old Catholics are thinking in a new way about things, a way that they recognize from actually the Bible. In one of your things, you quote Cesar Chavez, where he says, "When we are really honest with ourselves, we must admit that our lives are all that really belong to us. So it is how we use our lives that determine what kind of men and women we are."
I was 21 years old when I found that quote, and it became the centerpiece of my life. And I think the next sentence is, "And therefore you have to enter the nonviolent struggle for justice and to be human."
It is my deepest belief that only by giving our lives do we find life. I am convinced that the truest act of courage, the strongest act of humanity, is to sacrifice ourselves for others in a totally nonviolent struggle for justice.
So I decided to give my life to that quote, and then about a month before he died, I spent an evening staying up late talking with Cesar Chavez. And two things I remember. One, I said to him, "Hey, when I'm lecturing and people say, 'What do I do?' Cesar, what should I say?" And he went like this: "Tell everybody for the rest of your life, John, that every person in the country and the world has to get involved with." And he went like this: public action, public action, public action for justice and peace. It was great. Everybody's got to do something. And then I told him how much that quote meant to me. And I said, "What do you think about it?" And he sat back and he goes, "It's still the center of my whole life and my belief." And he died about a month later. It was one of the great moments of my life. And that quote is critically important for all of us.
For all of us.
He's talking there about our humanity. To be human is to be nonviolent and working for justice for our sisters and brothers around the planet, and to be working to end war and to live in peace with every human being, all creatures, all creation. It's so beautiful. That's what it means to be a human being. I could add to be Christian, to be religious, to be spiritual. But he widened it and said, we're just humans, we are peacemakers. Thank you, Cesar Chavez.
So the three elements of your beliefs are?
Well, this is what I wrote in my book, The Nonviolent Life. I've been studying this for...
Listen, I just want to show this.
Yeah,
This
I put
is
a picture.
your new book,
Yeah.
The Nonviolent Life. I'll show some of your older ones later. Talk to me about the three...
Well, I've been talking about nonviolence for 35 years, and I've been studying Gandhi and Dr. King like morning, noon, and night. And I speak to maybe millions of people. How do you explain this? So I've been proposing that this holistic vision of nonviolence, which Gandhi and Dr. King show us, require three simultaneous attributes, if you're with me on this. So you have to do all three. Number one, you have to be really nonviolent to yourself. And I'll say all three first. Number two, at the same time, you have to be meticulously nonviolent toward every human being you know, every human being on the planet, all the creatures and all creation. And third, at the same time, you have to have one foot in the global grassroots movement for a more just and peaceful world. And I put it this way because we're all good maybe at one of them. You know, like church people are really nice. And we're really peaceful. But we're not doing anything to end the starvation in the world. And then on the other far extreme, there's a lot of us activists, and we're mean and mad. We're not very peaceful people, and we're not good at our relationships. Gandhi and King say we have to do all three. When I talk, I say to people, how can you be more nonviolent to yourself? To non-cooperate with the roots of violence in you, to cultivate a real interior peace. Of course, this is what prayer and spirituality and meditation are about. And secondly, looking at your life, your family, your relationships, your workplace. How can you be more nonviolent to people? And who's the one who really pushes all your buttons? And how those difficult people become your teachers because they're exposing your violence. And how do you be nonviolent with them? These are great human questions. And your relationship with the whole world. And third, what are you doing? This is what Cesar Chavez said to me. And I always say, Oscar Romero said this, nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. Pick one issue and get involved. A lot of young people are getting involved in the environment or get involved in work to end war or nuclear weapons. But once you enter into the struggle, you're really involved in trying to change the whole world. I don't know if that makes sense, Lorraine, but you see, it's a challenging vision. But it's really carrying on the legacy of people like Cesar Chavez, like a holistic nonviolence, and that's what we need.
Well, we're speaking today with Reverend John Dear, and you are actually doing a very public, very important vigil and conference coming up soon. So this is one of the posters for it. We're about to celebrate that 70th we're about to
commemorate.
observe, the 70th anniversary of Hiroshima.
Yeah.
And so, what are you doing to observe
Right.
that?
Well, so 70 years ago, our country vaporized 200,000 human beings at Hiroshima in Japan and Nagasaki, Japan. And a year or two ago, the U.S. Congress voted and approved $1 trillion to upgrade the entire nuclear arsenal over the next 30 years. Did you know that, Lorraine?
No.
Nobody's talking about it. It wasn't even on the front page of the New York Times, but it's a done deal. Think what we could do with that money. Meanwhile, every nuclear bomb the United States has made has been built in our backyard here in New Mexico at Los Alamos. We've been on and off the poorest state in the country with so much poverty and violence and needs, and yet we're number one in military spending, number one in nuclear weapons, maybe number one in millionaires and PhDs at Los Alamos, here surrounded by this poverty. So we're going up to Los Alamos for a Gandhian Christian peace vigil, calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons. On Thursday, August 6th, the actual 70th anniversary of Hiroshima, will be at Ashley Pond in the park downtown, right on the place where they actually built the Hiroshima bomb. Our speaker will be Roshi Joan Halifax from Upaya Zen Center here in Santa Fe. On Sunday, August 9th, we expect a much bigger crowd for the anniversary of Nagasaki. We'll be there from 11 to 2, again in Ashley Pond at the park. And we have a whole series of speakers from the leading peacemakers in the country, including Martin Luther King Jr.'s best friend, Reverend Jim Lawson, who's my friend too. King called him the greatest teacher of nonviolence in the world. He's 86. It's the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. It's the first anniversary of Ferguson, but he's going to be with us at Los Alamos saying all the issues are one. And our message is, with all due love and respect, we call upon everybody to quit their jobs at Los Alamos and to work for nonviolent ways to resolve our conflicts, to not spend these billions and maybe $1 trillion on weapons of mass destruction to clean up the earth, resolve extreme poverty, and fund nonviolent conflict resolution. But, you know, the Pope said last month in Turin, Italy, I've actually been in correspondence with him, and I had written this to him, but you can look it up. He said, you cannot be a Catholic anymore if you work on building weapons of mass destruction. Pope Francis said that last month. 20,000 people at Los Alamos, most of them are Christian and Catholic, very devout, good church people, building weapons of mass destruction. This compartmentalization of our lives has to stop. We need people to stand up and have the courage to say, I'm not going to spend my life in the big business of death. And reclaim their souls. This is the way Gandhi talked about the development of the bomb, and help fund and support movements for nonviolence. I know these are big things. I invite people to come and join us, to listen and learn. If you can't be there, to pray about it and think about what kind of New Mexico and country and world do we want. And my vision is the future would be a new nonviolent New Mexico, a New Mexico without nuclear weapons, and a nonviolent world.
You are going right to the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
There are, I can see why this is an unpopular stance in the state. There are those who believe that by using the nuclear weapons, they saved many, many American lives. And there are also those who believe that they can be in the world but not of it, that it's just a job. And that they have compartmentalize what they do in the ultimate end of what they're doing to just like, I go to church, I tithe, I take in, stray cats, and without looking down the road. So you're really challenging people in a way.
But so is Pope Francis, and so are the peacemakers and Jesus. You know, we know historically now that myth of the Pentagon is a lie, that the Japan was about to surrender, and that we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to impress the Soviet Union, that we would be the leader in this new Cold War. Don't have time to get into it, but people, if they're interested, there's a lot of great new history books coming out to unpack that myth, that the bombs saved lives. That's baloney. And one great historian is Gar Alparovitz, who's written great books on that.
Oh, yeah,
and
I've interviewed him.
Yeah. And, and with all due love and respect, again, I'm saying to the people of Los Alamos, the people are good, the work is evil. which is a subtle distinction. I'm not pointing fingers. We're all in this together. I need them. They're the only ones who know how to dismantle these things. But that logic, forgive me, bless me, for I have sinned, is the logic of the Nazis. We heard that in the Nuremberg trials. I was only doing my job. And we now know under international law that that's not good enough. We know that weapons of mass destruction violate international law, and anything that supports genocide is against the Nuremberg principles. People need to have the courage to stand up, even under international law, and say, I shouldn't be making a living off the possibility of the death of millions of people. I'm arguing you can't do that as a Christian. I would say Cesar Chavez and Gandhi would say you can't do it as a human being. But we're brighter and better, and we know that nukes aren't helping us. They're still bankrupting us all. We can all become peacemakers, and that's my open prayer for everybody.
Well, in your autobiography, it's called A Persistent Peace, One Man's Struggle for a Nonviolent World. You are really struggling in a very violent world. Also another book that I'm very fond of, Transfiguration, a Meditation on Transforming Ourselves and Our World. But there are those, and people who are interested in your work besides reading all the books. You're also right in the Huffington Post, the New York Times, the Washington Post. One of the pieces that you wrote in the Huffington Post was about Tim DeChristopher. And this is a young man I've interviewed before he went to jail and after he went to jail. But he did what, in one of your books you say, nonviolence confronts systemic injustice with active love, but refuses to retaliate with further violence under any circumstances. This young man went to jail as an act of climate justice, and then he came out. He says the funniest thing. I said, well, what was it like being in jail? He says, I'm an introvert, and it was wonderful having bars keeping people away from me. But he studied how all the old civil rights people, how they use their time in jail. His was a movement with singing, and he told the judge, he said, this is what love looks like. Right. I'm doing this because I love the world, and so there are individuals who are doing this, and we need to focus on them and let them be our inspiration, as well as Gandhi. And
Right. And there's a lot of new people, like Tim's my friend and a great inspiration to young people all over the country and the world. We all need to become like Tim DeChristopher. What he did was he took a risk with his own life on behalf of the planet. That's the spiritual life, I argue. And how can we do that in New Mexico? Whether you're a politician or in the media or at home with your kids or in schools, to help people become more nonviolent, to help end poverty here, and to help make a more peaceful world. We're all going to have to step up to the plate like Tim DeChristopher and do what we can to end the violence and the war making and to lift up a vision of a new world. We just all need to get involved now. And
so the peace movement or nonviolent movement is one of the ancient elemental concepts common to all religions. And yet it's up against this very violent world.
It's very, very interesting. I came to the conclusion that nonviolence is at the heart of every religion. And it took me many decades to learn that. I actually learned it not just from books, but meeting religious activists. So that Judaism holds us this spectacular vision of shalom. They're going to beat their swords into plowshares and never study war again. Hinduism, like embodied by Gandhi, Islam means peace. I know hundreds of Muslims working for justice and peace through radical nonviolence, and they're telling me because of the Quran. Buddhism, spectacular compassion, even Christianity. But they've all gotten co-opted. And, people over the centuries, we have compartmentalized our lives. I'm arguing you cannot claim to be of any religion or spiritual tradition unless you're going deep into nonviolence, which means love and peace and compassion. And that's got to affect what's going on inside your life, your relationships, your work, and your place in the world right now, especially in all this violence. And, the only way we can really make a difference, I'm talking about ending war. This is harder than the abolitionists. They had to do was end slavery. We're talking about ending war, ending poverty, ending nuclear weapons, ending catastrophic violent environmental destruction. The only way that's going to happen is if everybody gets involved in the grassroots movement. That's why we need things like our vigils at Los Alamos, and marches like last year's in New York City against climate change. And we need all the different movements to come together. And I need people to support the movements, the churches to get involved, all kinds of leaders to step up to the plate. We need new politicians who uphold a vision of a nonviolent world. We need religious leaders not to be afraid anymore to lose their collections and to be, have people walk out on them, but to uphold the spiritual cores of their traditions, especially Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Love your enemies. Blessed are the peacemakers. And I just hope everyone can get more involved.
Well, it is such a paralyzing paradox when you hold that, and that's what Jesus did with his parables, to say, oh, it's just like a rich man entering the kingdom of heaven like a camel going through the eye of a needle. Yeah. When you hold that dissonance, then you can perhaps consider something new. And you have brought us some very dissonant and challenging ideas, and I hope that our audience can hold this and try to feel where you're coming from, and look for ways that they can look for nonviolent path in their own life. It's very challenging in this world.
Yeah, but life is short, and we all may only have so many years left, and we're going to die someday. And I like to invite people to raise the bar, to think of a higher standard. As a kid, I chose to listen to the greatest people. So I set my sights on Gandhi and Dr. King and Archbishop Tutu and these great people. And I encourage everybody to do that and to go deep into their spiritual traditions. What would Jesus want? What would Buddha want? What would the Jewish prophets be saying? And let's not just listen to very average global leaders or our own national leaders and politicians. Let's set our sights on these great spiritual visionaries and try to live up to their ideals and reclaim our humanity in the process. These struggles, these visions, these ideals make life worth living.
Well, you are definitely walking your talk, and thank you so much for coming to be with us today. Our guest today is Reverend John Dear. His new book, really an amazing read, The Nonviolent Life. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm Lorene Mills. This is Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.